I stood beneath crystal lights in a downtown hall that smelled of money and confidence, watching my son celebrate another year of his life inside a company I had built with my hands and my patience. When he took the microphone, the room leaned toward him. He thanked his wife's father for paying for everything. Then he turned his eyes to me and said I had contributed nothing. Laughter moved through the crowd like a soft wave, followed by the knowing looks that do real damage. In that moment I understood it wasn't careless. It was surgical. I walked to the edge of the stage, placed a steady hand on his shoulder, nodded once and left without a word. Outside, among luxury cars, I sat alone in my modest vehicle and felt something finally settle into place. This wasn't humiliation, it was confirmation. If you've ever been quietly erased by someone you loved, stay with me. Subscribe, not because this is entertainment but because stories like this need witnesses. And if you've lived through something similar, tell me in the comments. Sometimes survival begins with being seen. I didn't rush when I left the hall. That mattered to me. If I had hurried, it would have looked like retreat. Instead, I let the doors close behind me at their own pace, felt the weight of them seal off the noise, the laughter, the small cruelty that had just been dressed up as a joke. Outside, the city held its breath the way it always does at night, glass towers lit from within, reflections multiplying until nothing felt solid. I crossed the sidewalk alone, my shoes sounding too loud against the pavement. Around me were cars that cost more than my first warehouse, their polished bodies catching the light like trophies. I found my own car where I'd left it, older, clean, paid for, invisible. I sat behind the wheel and didn't start the engine right away. Inside that room I had felt something familiar but long ignored, the sensation of being edited out. Not erased in one stroke, but reduced line by line until the final version no longer included me. I had seen it before in contracts, in meetings where decisions were announced as if they had emerged fully formed, without acknowledging the hands that built the foundation. This was the same thing, only personal. More precise. I drove without destination, letting the streets choose for me. The radio stayed off. My phone buzzed once, then again, lighting up the dark interior. I didn't look. I already knew who it was. The city thinned out, the buildings giving way to quieter blocks where offices slept behind tinted glass. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, older than I felt, steadier than I expected. There was no anger there. Just clarity. I pulled over near the river, cut the engine and let the silence in. That's when it happened. Not loudly. Not all at once. My chest tightened, and the weight I'd been carrying for years finally asked to be acknowledged. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and let the truth settle. This moment hadn't started tonight. Tonight had simply been the confirmation that whatever bond one thought still existed had already been severed elsewhere. I stayed there until my breathing evened out. When I drove home, I ignored the calls that kept coming. By the time I reached my door, I knew what morning would bring. And I knew who I would call first. Sleep never came. I lay on top of the sheets, fully dressed, staring at a ceiling I'd repaired myself years earlier, tracing old imperfections with my eyes. Every few minutes my phone vibrated on the nightstand, the screen lighting up the room in brief, nervous pulses. I never touched it. I didn't need to read the names to know the pattern: confusion first, then concern, then the early stages of fear. Sometime after midnight, I stood and turned on the desk lamp in my study. The light fell across shelves of binders, folders labeled in my own handwriting. This room had always been my insurance against chaos. When things went wrong, I came here and took stock. I started pulling documents down one at a time. Corporate structure filings. Share distributions. Amendments written after long conversations, after promises made over coffee, after assurances that family and business could coexist without consequence. I laid them out across the desk and the floor, not frantic, not emotional, methodical. This wasn't about proving anything to myself. It was about confirming what I already suspected. The numbers told the story cleanly. Majority ownership. Voting control. Signature authority that had never been transferred, despite the appearances cultivated in boardrooms and at public events. Powers of attorney drafted for emergencies but never activated. Succession plans that named my son as a future steward, not a present master. I had not given away what he thought he had taken. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought sadness. Because it meant the moment at the microphone wasn't ignorance, it was ambition outrunning patience. Someone had convinced him the past was an inconvenience and I was part of it. Near dawn, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window. The city was beginning to move again, lights switching off as people prepared for another day of believing in the roles they'd assigned themselves. My phone finally stopped vibrating. Silence returned, heavier now. I sat back down and opened my contacts, scrolling past familiar names until I found the one I needed. An attorney I'd worked with for years, someone who understood discretion as well as leverage. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I only checked the time and waited until it was decent to call. When I finally lay down again, it wasn't to sleep. It was to rest in the knowledge that by this time tomorrow, the shape of things would begin to change. Not loudly. Not publicly. But permanently. I placed the call just after 8, when offices are awake but the day hasn't yet learned how to resist. He answered on the second ring, his voice unchanged by time, measured, alert, already listening for what wasn't being said. I didn't describe the event in detail. I didn't need to. I told him there had been a public incident, that reputational harm had been done deliberately, and that I believed speed now mattered more than sentiment. He didn't interrupt. He never did. When I finished, there was a pause long enough to mean he was choosing words carefully. He asked one question, whether I still held independent authority. I told him I did. That was enough. We agreed to meet first thing the next morning. In person. No assistance. No calendar trails longer than necessary. When the call ended, I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, feeling the quiet certainty that comes when you stop hoping someone will change and start accepting that you must. The rest of the day moved slowly. I showered, dressed simply, ate without tasting. Calls came in again, more frequent now, their urgency escalating. I let them go unanswered. Silence, I've learned, is sometimes the only boundary people understand. That evening, I returned to the study and opened the safe built into the wall behind the bookshelf. Inside were older documents, the kind you don't reference often but never discard. Property titles. Trust outlines. Letters written years ago, intended for contingencies I'd hoped would never arrive. I didn't read them with nostalgia. I read them the way a pilot checks instruments before committing to a course correction. Everything I needed was there. Before turning in, I wrote a short list on a legal pad. Not of grievances but of actions. Clean, sequential, unemotional. When I finished, I tore the page free and folded it once, slipping it into my jacket pocket for the morning. As I turned off the light, my phone buzzed again on the nightstand. I didn't look. Whoever was calling was already behind the curve. Tomorrow would not be about confrontation. It would be about structure. And once structure changes, everything else follows. The attorney's office hadn't changed. Same muted walls, same deliberate quiet, the kind designed to make people speak carefully. I arrived early and waited without touching my phone. When he came in, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered coffee and time. Both mattered. I laid out the incident the way I'd learned to present facts over decades. No embellishment, no emotion. A public statement. A false attribution. An audience large enough to carry it forward. Intent inferred not from tone, but from context and timing. As I spoke, he took notes sparingly, already seeing the outline of something larger. When I finished, I slid the folded page from my pocket onto the desk. The list of actions. He read it once, then again more slowly. He confirmed what I already knew but needed to hear from someone else. My position was secure, but only as long as I acted before momentum shifted. Reputation damage inside a company isn't just social, it's strategic. Left unaddressed, it invites others to test boundaries they wouldn't otherwise approach. We talked about options. Defensive measures first. Asset exposure. Speed. He used words like liquid, clean, irreversible. Not as threats but as tools. He made it clear that waiting would be interpreted as consent by anyone already planning around me. I asked him one thing, whether acting now would look vindictive. He shook his head. He said timing doesn't determine intent, preparation does. And mine had been years in the making whether I admitted it or not. By the time I stood to leave, the path forward felt narrow but solid. He would begin discreet outreach immediately. I would maintain routine. No changes visible from the outside. The illusion of normalcy was no longer a courtesy, it was camouflage. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed again. Missed calls stacked one on top of another, their insistence growing louder by the minute. I silenced it without checking. Inside the vehicle, I sat for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the wheel. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed anymore. What I felt was resolve, the kind that comes when you finally stop negotiating with the version of someone you hoped they'd be. The next move wouldn't happen in a boardroom or at a microphone. It would happen quietly, in files and signatures and doors that close without ceremony. And once it began, there would be no reason to announce it. I waited until the building emptied. That was important. Familiar routines create blind spots, and blind spots are easier to move through than locked doors. I still had access, badges don't expire as quickly as trust does, and no one questioned my presence. They never had. The corridors were dim, lit only by emergency strips and the city glow bleeding through glass. Offices stood open like paused lives. Jackets on chairs, half-finished coffee cups, whiteboards filled with plans that assumed continuity. I moved past them without stopping. This wasn't about curiosity. It was about confirmation. My son's office sat at the end of the hall. Larger than mine ever had been, decorated to project momentum. I closed the door behind me and stood still for a moment, listening to the hum of the building. Then I went to work. The files were organized the way someone organizes when they expect to be challenged: clean names, neutral folders, nothing that looks incriminating at first glance. But ambition leaves fingerprints. Projections that stretch too far. Timelines that skip necessary steps. Language that shifts from we to they when discussing ownership. I found drafts referencing a merger pathway that had never crossed my desk. External entities aligned closely with my son's father-in-law, names that appeared too often to be coincidence. Emails carefully worded, cautious but clear in intent. Plans that assumed my absence not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. I didn't take anything. I photographed what mattered, methodically, preserving context as much as content. Dates, senders, attachments. Enough to establish a pattern without alerting anyone to its discovery. When I finished, I restored everything exactly as I'd found it. As I turned off the light, there was no satisfaction in what I'd learned. Only a dull ache. This wasn't a spontaneous betrayal born of pride. It was coordinated. Rehearsed. The moment at the microphone hadn't been a mistake, it had been a signal. I left the building the way I'd entered, unremarkable. Outside, the night air felt heavier than before. I sat in my car and sent a single message to my attorney: "I have confirmation. It aligns." His reply came quickly. "Then we move now." I drove home without thinking about the route. The city lights blurred past, indifferent to intention. By the time I reached my door, I understood that whatever relationship I thought I was protecting no longer existed in the form I remembered. What remained was responsibility, to myself, to what I'd built, and to the truth that had finally stopped asking to be ignored. Tomorrow things would accelerate. Quietly. And by the time anyone noticed, the window to stop it would already be closed. The next few days required discipline. Not the loud kind that announces itself, but the quieter kind that holds its shape under pressure. I went to the office at the usual time. I nodded to the same people. I answered questions with the same economy of words. From the outside nothing had changed. Inside everything had. The negotiations began under the cover of routine. My attorney framed it as exploratory, an operational conversation with an external logistics firm interested in expansion. Due diligence requests were couched as audits, the kind companies perform all the time when they're thinking ahead. No one was alarmed. They shouldn't have been. Preparation is rarely suspicious when it looks like competence. I avoided my son as much as possible without making it obvious. When we crossed paths, he spoke more carefully than before, his confidence dulled by uncertainty. He asked if I'd left early the night of the event because I wasn't feeling well. I told him I'd needed air. It was true in a way that didn't require explanation. At home the calls continued. Messages piled up, their tone shifting with each hour that passed unanswered. First irritation, then concern, then something close to panic. I listened to none of them. Voices have a way of pulling you back into arguments that no longer matter. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the photographs again. Not because I needed reassurance but because I needed resolve. Each email, each attachment, each projection pointed in the same direction. The business I had built was already being mentally transferred to someone else. My continued presence was an inconvenience to be managed, not a partnership to be honored. I thought about the birthday event then, not the words spoken but the ease with which they'd been delivered. Public humiliation only works when the speaker believes the target can't respond without making things worse. That assumption had been the real mistake. By the end of the week, the outlines of the sale were clear. Accelerated. Clean. No prolonged courtship. The kind of transaction that closes before rumors learn how to walk. I signed where instructed, asked the questions that mattered, ignored the rest. Late one night, I stood by the window again, city lights stretched thin below me. My phone lay face down on the counter, silent now, as if exhausted by its own persistence. I felt no urge to turn it over. There's a moment in every long conflict when you realize the outcome is no longer uncertain. Only the timing is. That realization doesn't bring relief. It brings distance. And distance, I was learning, was exactly what I needed for what came next. There was one matter left to address before anything closed. It wasn't corporate, not on paper anyway, but it was tied to the same assumption, that what I provided was permanent, unconditional, and therefore no longer mine to manage. Years earlier, I had transferred a downtown apartment into my son's name. At the time it felt practical. He was starting out. I wanted him close. I told myself it was an investment in stability, not leverage. I also told myself gratitude would be implicit. Experience should have taught me better. The deed transfer had included language that most people skim past. Conditions. Reversion clauses. Protections I'd insisted on back when I still believed foresight was just good parenting, not preparation for betrayal. Those clauses had never been tested. Until now. I met with my attorney again briefly. No drama. No debate. The paperwork moved faster than I expected. When something is structured correctly from the beginning, reclaiming it doesn't look aggressive, it looks administrative. The apartment was transferred into the name of a trusted relative by the end of the day. Access codes were changed. Keys accounted for. Utilities redirected. No announcements were made. None were required. I imagined the moment my son would discover it, not yet but soon. The confusion first. The disbelief. The instinct to call me and demand an explanation. I wondered if he would remember the conversations we'd had years ago, the ones where I spoke carefully about responsibility and permanence. I wondered if he'd dismissed them the same way he dismissed everything else that didn't serve his timeline. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen and ate a simple meal. The phone lit up again, a familiar number flashing insistently. I let it ring until it stopped. Then again. And again. I didn't feel cruel. I felt resolved. Boundaries aren't punishments. They're acknowledgments of reality, of limits, of what you will no longer pretend not to see. When I finally went to bed, I slept. Not deeply but enough. In the morning, the final signatures would be executed. After that, there would be no ambiguity left for anyone to argue against. The structure would change hands. Authority would be revoked. And the version of me they had spoken about so casually, so dismissively, would no longer be available to correct them. That chapter was already closed. The closing didn't feel dramatic. There was no raised voice, no last-minute revelation, no sense of triumph. Just signatures applied in the correct places, dates entered carefully, and a quiet acknowledgement that something long-standing had reached its natural conclusion. The acquiring firm moved quickly, exactly as my attorney had predicted. They were efficient, disciplined, uninterested in family history. To them, the business was an asset with value, not a legacy wrapped in sentiment. That detachment worked in my favor. Emotions complicate things. Numbers do not. I signed away my majority stake for a single clean sum. No installments. No earn-outs. No lingering advisory roles designed to soothe egos. When the ink dried, authority shifted completely. Board permissions. Banking access. Signature rights. All of it transferred at once, leaving no room for interpretation. By mid-morning it was done. I sat alone in the conference room afterward, long after everyone else had left. The table still bore the faint impressions of documents that had been there only minutes earlier. I traced one mark with my finger, not out of nostalgia but habit. This room had been the site of so many decisions, some right, some merely necessary. Today's fell into the latter category. My phone buzzed again. This time more insistently. Missed calls stacked faster now, the intervals between them shrinking. I didn't check the messages, but I could imagine the progression without effort. Confusion. Anger. Fear. The dawning realization that something fundamental had shifted without permission. I stood, gathered my coat, and walked out through the lobby. The receptionist smiled the way she always did, unaware that the company she worked for now belonged to someone else. By the time she learned, the narrative would already be set, shaped by press releases and internal memos that used neutral language to describe irreversible change. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. I felt lighter than I expected, though not relieved. Letting go of something you built doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like acknowledgement, that your role has been fulfilled whether others agree or not. As I drove away, my phone finally fell silent. Not because the calls had stopped, but because something else had begun. Discovery I knew would come next. And with it, consequences I no longer needed to manage. I didn't look back at the building. Some exits don't require ceremony. I wasn't there when he found out. That was intentional. Discovery is a private thing even when it happens in public spaces. I learned about it later, indirectly, through the kinds of channels that always activate when control changes hands. Short messages from people who had never reached out before, cautious inquiries disguised as concern. By mid-morning, the office doors had new names on them. By noon, access credentials had been reset. By early afternoon, security had been instructed to follow procedure without discussion. My son arrived expecting a normal day. That much I knew. Normalcy had been his greatest assumption. He walked into a building that no longer recognized him, past a reception desk that redirected him politely, firmly, without apology. When he protested, it wasn't treated as a disagreement. It was treated as confusion. Human resources handled the rest. Efficient. Scripted. They explained that ownership had changed, that his role was no longer required, that personal belongings would be escorted out. The words "not required" do a particular kind of damage when spoken in a place you believed you ran. I pictured him standing there trying to recalibrate, trying to understand how authority can vanish without a warning shot. I imagined the instinct to call me rising immediately, the need for clarification, for reassurance, for something familiar to grab onto. The calls came exactly as expected. One after another. Dozens. The phone lighting up so often it felt like a pulse. I let it sit on the counter, unmoved. By late afternoon, the tone of the messages shifted. The anger softened. The questions grew less accusatory, more pleading. Words like misunderstanding and talk began to appear. I did none of it. Silence in moments like that isn't cruelty. It's consequence. Every explanation invites negotiation. Every response offers the illusion that something is still open for revision. Nothing was. By evening, I heard through a mutual contact that he'd left the building with a small box in his hands, escorted not by force but by protocol. That detail stayed with me. How quietly power can remove someone when it no longer needs to argue. I made dinner that night and ate slowly. Outside, the city lights came on as they always did, indifferent to upheaval. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. And being finished, I was learning, was its own kind of peace. The calls didn't stop after that night. They multiplied. Numbers I hadn't seen in years surfaced, people orbiting close enough to feel the shift but far enough to pretend neutrality. Some left messages heavy with concern, others thinly veiled with self-interest. I listened to none of them. The pattern had already revealed itself. My son tried other routes when mine stayed closed. He went to his wife's father first. That alliance, I learned later, cooled almost immediately. Plans that depend on access collapse quickly when access disappears. Promises tied to futures that no longer exist lose their warmth overnight. Support became distance. Distance became silence. The marriage followed the same arc. Pressure has a way of exposing the joints in a structure. Without the business, without the leverage he believed was secure, the dynamic shifted. Accusations replaced strategy. Blame surfaced where coordination once lived. I didn't need details. I recognized the signs. I'd seen them in failing partnerships more times than I could count. What surprised me wasn't the speed of it, but the inevitability. Once the illusion of control was gone, there was nothing left to negotiate with. No one rallies around a plan that no longer offers advantage. Loyalty built on outcome is not loyalty at all. I stayed out of the city as much as possible during that period. Took long drives. Walked unfamiliar streets. Let routines loosen their grip. At night, I slept more deeply than I had in years, as if my body understood before my mind did that the long vigilance was finally over. Occasionally I checked my phone, not for messages but for the absence of them. Missed calls slowed, then stopped. The last voicemail came late one evening, his voice stripped of performance, reduced to something raw and uncertain. He asked for time. For a conversation. For understanding. I deleted it without listening twice. Not because I lacked compassion but because I finally understood its limits. Compassion does not require proximity. Forgiveness does not demand access. Some lessons arrive too late to be taught gently. When the city lights faded in my rearview mirror for the last time, I felt no triumph. Only closure. And closure, I'd learned, doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a door closing behind you that you don't bother to reopen. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. Not because I wanted to disappear, but because departures explained in advance invite negotiation, and I was no longer negotiating my life. I sold what needed to be sold. Gave away what no longer mattered. Packed only the things that had followed me through decades, books with notes in the margins, tools worn to the shape of my hands, a few photographs that had survived every move because they didn't ask anything of me. The rest stayed behind, artifacts of a version of myself that had completed its work. On my last morning in the city, I woke early and walked the neighborhood once more. Office towers reflected the sunrise without recognition. Cafes opened their doors. People hurried past with purpose borrowed from schedules they didn't control. I felt separate from it all in a way that wasn't lonely, more like finished reading a book and setting it down gently. The drive out was unremarkable. Highways don't care about intent. They simply carry you forward if you keep moving. I watched the skyline recede in the mirror until it flattened into something abstract, then disappeared entirely. My phone stayed in the glove compartment. I didn't turn it on. Whatever was waiting there could wait longer. Some conversations lose their meaning once distance has done its work. By afternoon, the landscape had changed. Open space replaced glass and steel. The air felt different, less crowded somehow. I pulled over once just to stand still and let the quiet register. It wasn't silence exactly. It was absence. And absence, I was discovering, can be generous. I arrived at my new place as the light softened. Nothing extravagant. Clean lines. Room enough to breathe. A desk near a window. That was all I needed. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, giving each object a place without urgency. That night, I sat outside and watched darkness settle without interruption. No calls. No messages. No need to explain myself to anyone who had already decided who I was. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was simply present. And that, more than any reversal or outcome, felt like the real conclusion I'd been moving toward all along. Weeks passed without markers. No deadlines. No meetings. No need to measure time by anyone else's expectations. I established a rhythm instead. Morning light through the window, coffee taken slowly, long walks that ended when they ended. For years, my life had been defined by reaction. Now it was defined by choice. I thought about my son more than I expected, but not the way I once did. The memory that returned most often wasn't the man at the microphone or the executive behind a desk. It was the boy he had been before ambition learned how to speak for him. That memory stayed intact, untouched by what came later. I let it remain that way. Regret tried to surface a few times. It always does. It arrived disguised as questions. What if I had spoken sooner? What if I had corrected him publicly? But those questions dissolved quickly. Public correction would have fed the spectacle. Silence had allowed the truth to work on its own schedule. Occasionally I checked the news out of habit. The company's name appeared once, briefly, folded into a larger story about consolidation. No mention of family. No mention of conflict. Just business doing what business does when it outgrows its origin story. I felt no pull to intervene. The distance had done its job. One afternoon, while sorting through a box I hadn't opened in years, I found a notebook from the earliest days of the company. Handwritten calculations. Rough ideas. Doubts scribbled in the margins. I sat with it for a long time, not out of nostalgia but recognition. Everything I'd needed to know about how this would end had been there from the beginning. I had simply chosen optimism over realism for longer than I should have. That didn't make me weak. It made me human. As the light faded, I closed the notebook and put it away. Some records are meant to be kept. Others are meant to be completed. When night came, it arrived without wait. No buzzing phone. No unfinished business. Just the steady quiet of a life no longer negotiated. I understood then that the story wasn't about loss or revenge or even justice. It was about alignment, between what I valued and how I chose to live once I stopped asking permission. There was one part left. Not an action but an acknowledgement. And it would come, not from him but from me. One evening, long after the urgency had drained from everything, I turned my phone back on. It didn't explode with sound the way it once would have. No cascade of missed calls. No frantic vibration. Just a few old notifications settling into place, already stale. Time had done its quiet work. There was one message I hadn't deleted. I'd avoided it deliberately, letting it sit like an unopened letter you already understand without reading. That night I opened it. My son's voice filled the room, tired, stripped of certainty, no audience left to perform for. He spoke slowly as if measuring each word, admitting confusion, admitting fear. He said he didn't understand how things had gone so wrong. He said he felt abandoned. He asked if we could talk just once to clear the air. I listened all the way through without interruption. When it ended, the room returned to stillness. No relief followed. No surge of emotion. Just clarity. I sat at the desk and took out a sheet of paper. Not to respond to him but to answer myself. I wrote without anger, without accusation. I wrote what I would have said if words could still reach him without being bent by expectation. I wrote that love does not survive humiliation. That trust does not endure erasure. That public dismissal is not an accident, it is a decision. And that consequences, once set in motion, do not require cruelty to be final. I wrote that I hoped he would one day understand the difference between inheritance and entitlement, between leadership and ownership, between confidence and respect. When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't meant to be sent. Writing it had been enough. I deleted the message and turned the phone off again. Outside the night was calm. No wind. No movement. Just the steady presence of a world that continues whether you participate in old roles or not. I realized then that closure doesn't come from being understood. It comes from no longer needing to be. There was only one part left now. Not reflection. Not distance. But peace. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It settled gradually, the way dust settles after a long renovation, quietly without asking for recognition. I noticed it first in small things. Mornings without tension in my shoulders. Afternoons that didn't feel like something was about to demand my attention. Evenings that belonged to me alone. I stopped thinking in terms of before and after. That division had served its purpose, but it wasn't necessary anymore. What mattered was now, this stretch of time where nothing was being taken from me, where no one was waiting for me to explain myself or prove my value. I took up old habits again. Reading slowly. Fixing things that didn't need fixing just to feel my hands work. Cooking meals that required patience instead of convenience. These weren't distractions. They were reminders of who I'd been before my identity became entangled with roles I'd outgrown. Occasionally, a thought of my son surfaced. Not sharp, not bitter. Just distant. I wondered who he would become once the noise faded, once he had to sit with the results of his choices without an audience to affirm them. I hoped, sincerely, that he would learn something useful from the silence I left behind. Whether he did or not was no longer my responsibility. What I kept in the end wasn't the money. That was just arithmetic. I kept my name intact. I kept the knowledge that I had acted without malice, without spectacle, without lowering myself to meet disrespect on its own terms. I kept my sense of proportion, the understanding that dignity doesn't need witnesses to be real. On my desk now sits nothing urgent. No files waiting to be reviewed. No decisions pressing against the edges of the day. Just a window, a chair, and enough quiet to hear my own thoughts without interruption. If there is justice in this story, it isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It lives in the simple fact that I wake each day aligned with myself, unburdened by explanations I no longer owe. Some endings are loud. This one wasn't. And that was exactly the point.